when I last talked about Zen, I was discussing it as a dialogue between master and student, and I was discussing it to a great extent in relation to Far Eastern culture, how it is in effect a method of liberation from the culture. All of us need to be liberated from our culture to a certain extent, because education is a kind of necessary evil. And when the process of education or acculturation has been completed, we need a cure for it. Education is like salting meat in order to preserve it for eating. But when you're ready to cook it and eat it, you need to soak some of the salt out. So in the process of being brought up by one's parents and one's teachers, you are in one way spoiled, although in another way made tolerable to live with. And so in our culture, it's increasingly fashionable to have psychoanalysis when you've finished with education, so as to work out and resolve all the damage and traumatic shocks that were done to you in the process. And it's becoming something that in sophisticated circles one goes through, not because you're a mentally sick person, but because it's considered beneficial to general mental health. And this is our fumbling attempt, you see, to find a cure for our own culture. We need a cure, of course, because the thing that we lose in the course of being brought up is spontaneity. That's what's so delightful about a child, as well as so objectionable. That children are just plain spontaneous, and when they do it in a way that pleases us, we think they're delightful. And when they do it in a way that doesn't please us, we think they're horrid. And so we pretty much kill the spontaneity in them in order to get certainly that they won't be horrid, and that they will be nice, but in a rather phony way. And this is such a disaster, isn't it? Because when we watch a child, say, dancing, and it's never had a single dancing lesson, and is really just dancing for fun, we say that's delightful. Then eventually the child notices that this is a way of getting attention and becomes self-conscious about dancing, and then we send it to dancing school, and it becomes stiff and wretched. And only after many, many years of practice does the child, as a dancer, now a young man or woman, recapture the spontaneity of childhood. It's got to go all that long way around to get back to the thing that it once had. And it's terribly difficult. So in the same way, with we might say the general attitude to life, that a child is taught to live as a child is taught to dance. It has to observe the rules. And in so doing, this thing arises that bugs us human beings beyond belief. That is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is, in one sense, our pride as human beings. It's the great thing we have. We can not only be happy, but we can know we're happy. We can not only think, but we can think about thinking. And therein lies the whole possibility of reasoning. To think about thinking, to know about knowing, to be aware of what one does. Herein is the whole birth of a rational control of behavior, which you might say is the glory of civilization and the glory of man. But at the same time, it's a perfect pest, because how do you know when to stop thinking about thinking? For instance, you think over a problem, you've got to make a decision. How long should you think about it? How much evidence should you collect before you take a step? You never know. Actually, what most of us do is we think about a given decision until it's a nuisance, and then or the time is too late to think about it anymore, then we do something. We never are sure that we decided the right thing. And one of the troubles about thinking about decisions is there are ever so many unpredictable variables that come into everything. And you may work out the most perfect business contract and everything is fine, but you didn't bargain for the banana skin that you were going to slip on your way to your partner's office or whatever it was. Such things couldn't be predicted in any amount of decision making. And the more we try to elaborate perfectly foolproof methods of arranging our lives, the more we find ourselves encumbered with impossible details. That's the fallacy of too much law. When we provide for everything in the law, suddenly find you can't move without filling out 300 forms, and without consulting all sorts of bureaucrats, without hiring a staff of lawyers and accountants and all kinds of things to be sure you don't make the wrong move. After a while, the game ceases to be worth the candle. I mean, life becomes so safe that it's not worth living at all. So this is one of the problems of being self-conscious. And all education, you see, is an instruction in self-consciousness. What do you learn in education? You learn fundamentally words. In other words, symbols about reality. And through words, we're able to talk about living. And so think about living. And so have knowledge about it. You see, no knowledge is academically respectable knowledge unless it's knowledge in terms of words or in terms of numbers. That is to say, in terms of a symbolic language about life. But you see, once you're in that position, once you know that you know, and you know you're alive, and you know you're going to die because you can predict, you feel you've lost your innocence. Something's gone wrong. This, in the Christian tradition, was the knowledge of good and evil. What it says in Hebrew is not exactly moral good and evil that was known as a result of eating the fruit of the tree, but what was advantageous and disadvantageous. It gave you the gift of being like God. That is to say, the gift of being able to control the course of events. And anybody who controls the course of events, you see, probably puts himself in the situation of the sorcerer's apprentice. The Lord looking down there and says, okay, you wanted to be God, man, you go ahead and try. You get in more and more of a mess. You know, you succeed amazingly. Just like the sorcerer's apprentice actually made that broom go and fetch water for him. But he couldn't stop it. And as we say today, you can't stop progress. So then the whole problem of self-consciousness is that you're always in a dither and a doubt. We call this anxiety. And a nostalgia develops among us for the age of innocence. Wouldn't it be nice not to have to make any decisions, to act entirely on whim? And if you got into trouble, well, that would be all right, because you wouldn't have been worrying about it. See, when a moth mistakes a candle for its sex call, which is what happens, that's why moths fly into candles, the moth makes a mistake, and powie, it goes out. That's that. Moth doesn't worry on the way to the candle whether it's going to get burned. And of course, the moths are sufficiently prolific so that one moth more or less lost in a candle doesn't matter. Hundreds of moths lost in candles don't matter. They just go on. And so you might imagine a human civilization where people make mistakes. And yes, they go off with a glorious bang instead of a whimper. And that's that. They wouldn't worry. They'd live magnificently. But we can't possibly go back and do that. You can't on purpose give up self-consciousness. You can't give up worrying. You can't give up thinking about yourself. And above all, you're terrified to live spontaneously, because you might do something wrong. However, the center of Zen training is to live spontaneously. And this is why it's so fascinating to many Western people, especially Western intellectuals, who are overburdened with self-consciousness. Because what fascinated people about Zen when they first heard of it through Dr. Suzuki's writings was Zen stories. I lent a book of Zen stories once to a friend of mine, years and years ago, and he was in hospital. And when he gave it back to me, he said, "Gee," he said, "I didn't understand a word of it, but it cheered me up enormously." So Zen, the literature of Zen, especially the literature of Zen in its early days, in the Tang Dynasty in China, we'll say a literature that runs from approximately 700 AD to 1000 AD. This span of years is the golden age of Zen. And almost all the literature of the period in early Buddhist Chinese is anecdotes about the encounters of Zen masters with their students. They are called in Japanese mondo, which means question-answer. And it appears that the way of studying Zen in those days was rather unlike the way of studying it now. Now Zen is settled and is studied in communities, such as we've been looking at, and will be staying in tomorrow night. But in those days, Zen was a wandering thing. In other words, if you became a Zen monk, you did a great deal of traveling. And instead of sitting on your fanny most of the day, you trudged. You were walking along through prairies, mountain paths, rugged country. You were visiting master after master after master to find one who would answer your question. Now, in a very natural way, supposing a person is questing, you are a seeker. You're not a phony seeker, but a real seeker. That is to say, you have within you a burning desire to find out what it's all about. Who you are, what life is, what reality is, or what's the way out of the mess. You want to become, instead of a mixed-up human being, you want to become something as simple and genuine as a tiger or a cat or a bird or a Buddha. So those monks used to wander and wander and wander in search of a man who would answer the question. So one of the first stories is that when Bodhidharma, or Dharma, who you see all over Japan as the man with big eyes, a bushy beard, usually dressed in red with no legs. He came to where Bodhidharma was meditating and said, "Master, I have no peace of mind. Please pacify my mind." Of course, he didn't even get in for a long time to ask the question, because Bodhidharma refused to see anybody. Finally, when he cut off his left arm as a token of his sincerity and presented it to the master, Bodhidharma said, "All right, what do you want?" Well, he said, "I have no peace of mind." The mind in Chinese is Shin, and it isn't quite what we mean by mind. They locate it here, Japanese kokoro. We locate our mind here. But this mind here, the heart mind, is the psychic center. When you say, "I have no peace of mind," it doesn't mean you've just got a headache. You may have a heartache too. It's a more inclusive word. You might call it the center of psychic activity. So Bodhidharma said to this man, whose name was Eka, "Bring out your mind here before me. I'll pacify it." And Eka said, "When I look for my mind, I can't find it." Bodhidharma said, "There, it's pacified." Now somehow this answered Eka's question. And all Zen is stories like that. Now one thing I must tell you about these stories. They are of the same nature as jokes. And that is to say, a joke is told with the object of making you laugh. Laughter is not an intellectual thing. It is an emotional reaction. And the point is the emotional reaction. If therefore a joke is explained to you, you may laugh out of politeness, a throaty laugh, but you will not laugh spontaneously, a belly laugh. Now the object of Zen stories is not to produce laughter, but to produce awakening, clarification, enlightenment, or what is called in Japanese, satori. Satori is like laughter, something that happens suddenly. You don't, as a rule, slowly begin to laugh and then laugh louder and louder, because you see a joke instantly. A joke is always a matter of an aha. So in the same way, these stories are intended to produce an aha reaction in you of, oh, but I see, now it's clear. And really, they don't contain any information. Their design is not to tell you something, that is to say, to impart information or knowledge. Their design is to get rid of something, to get rid of a false problem with which you are wrestling, so that the problem will disappear as a result of understanding the story. And you'll see from the story that I told you that what happened was the disappearance of a problem. Because Eka, when he looked for his mind that was giving him so much trouble, couldn't find it. There was a master walking in the forest with a group of his disciples, and suddenly he picked up a tree branch and said to one of the monks, "What is it?" And the monk hesitated, didn't answer immediately, so the teacher hit him with it. So he turned to another monk and said, "What is it?" And the monk said, "Give it to me so that I can see." And the master tossed him the branch. He caught it and he hit the master with it. And so the master said, "Well, you got out of that dilemma." There was another occasion when an officer of the army came to a Zen master and said, "Sir, I've heard a very strange story and I want to know your answer to it. Once upon a time there was a man who kept a goose in a bottle, and it grew so large that he couldn't get it out. Now, he didn't want to break the bottle and he didn't want to hurt the goose, so how does he get it out?" And the master changed the subject and said something like, "It's a nice day today, isn't it? And the waterfall making a lovely sound outside." And so they went on in pleasant conversation. And then the officer got up to leave, and as he walked away to the door, the master said, "Oh, officer!" And he turned around and said, "Yes?" And the master said, "There, it's out." Another time, there was a famous master called Suibi, and he was asked, "What is the secret teaching of Buddhism?" And he was asked this in the lecture hall, where other monks were studying. And he said, "Wait till there's no one around and I'll tell you." So later in the day, the monk accosted him and said, "There's nobody around now. What is the secret teaching of Buddhism?" So he went into the garden with this monk, and he pointed at the bamboos. And the monk said, "I don't understand." He said, "What a tall one that is, what a short one that is." And this awakened the monk. Then there was another monk whose name was Gute. And whenever people came to ask him question about Buddhism, he'd hold up a finger. That was the only answer he'd give. Well, he had an attendant. And one day somebody came to the temple to inquire about the teaching being given there, and the master was apparently out, and his attendant was there. So the investigator said, "What is your teaching here?" And the attendant held up a finger. Went away, but actually the master had been there. He was peeking from behind a screen. And so he came out to this boy and said, "What's the fundamental teaching of Buddhism?" And the boy held up a finger. Instantly the master drew a knife and cut it off. And the boy was very dismayed and rushed away yelling. So the master said, "Hey, come back!" As he came back, he said, "What's the fundamental principle of Buddhism?" And he went to hold up the finger, and it wasn't there. And he was enlightened. There is a Chinese god whose name is Pingting, and this is the god of fire. And there was a monk who was traveling, and he came to a new master. He had been to someone else, and he said, well, who did you study with before you came to me? Or he said, I studied with so-and-so. He said, what did he teach you? Well, he said, when I asked about the fundamental meaning of Buddhism, he answered me, ping ting comes for fire. Well, the master said, that was an excellent answer, but I bet you didn't understand it. Oh yes, he said, I understood it, because ping ting is the god of fire. And when, if ping ting should ask for fire, that would be like me asking about Buddhism, because I'm really a Buddha already. The master shook his head. I said, I knew it. He said, you missed the point completely. Well, he said, well, how would you deal with it? The master said, you asked me. So the monk said, what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism? And the master said, ping ting comes for fire. And the monk got the point. Well, you know, you can go on with these stories indefinitely. And but you'll notice certain dynamics in them. They require, as a rule, a solution to a dilemma. Or they do something that creates what we would call a state of blockage. When you're posed with something completely unusual, and you don't know how to react to it in a normal, automatic way. You see, if somebody says to you in the street, good morning, you say good morning, and you're not being spontaneous, you're being merely automatic. But when somebody comes up to you and says, are you saved? Or do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior? It's a very unusual question, and it stalls most people. They say, well, what do you mean? Or something funny like that, you know, or they feel embarrassed by religious questions. And, or somebody might say to you, why have you got such long toenails? When you're wearing a shoe and nobody can see it, you see. Anything that absolutely disrupts the normal flow of interchange. Well, then you're nonplussed. And the object of Zen is never to be nonplussed. That's, you see, to be nonplussed is the real meaning of the Buddhist doctrine of what's called bonno in Japanese, which means entanglements or defilements, or attachments, we might call them. Worldly attachments. It is not a worldly attachment in Buddhist philosophy to enjoy dinner. That is natural, you see. It is not a worldly attachment to need to sleep. That is perfectly natural. But it is worldly attachment to be sticky. That's to say, to be like a wheel that sticks on the axle and squeaks. So we are sticky when we are in a certain way self-conscious. We are, as we would say, all balled up or all clutched up. And we've lost our original spontaneity. And we are not, as it were, flowing with the stream of the Tao, the course of nature, or whatever you want to call it. So then all these questions put you in a dilemma. And the point is to see if you can get out of the dilemma without a moment's hesitation. That doesn't mean doing it quickly, necessarily, because if you're in a hurry to give a quick answer, that itself is a form of blockage. You should all read in this connection a translation in Suzuki's book Zen and Japanese Culture of a letter written by Takuan, who invented pickled radishes. I told you about, you know. Those yellow daikons are called Takuan after this man. And he wrote a letter on the art of swordsmanship, where he explains the necessity of spontaneity in fencing is that if you have to stop to think about how you're going to respond to a certain kind of attack, it's too late. You'll be dead. You must respond in the same way as when you clap the hands, the sound comes out without a moment's hesitation. Or when you strike steel on flint, there is no waiting before the spark comes out. But he adds, if you try to be quick, this will itself be a block. So when, you may know this, that when people are trained in the use of the sword, they get what Anne Clark bought the other day, which is a bamboo sword to start with. And you can give a person a healthy clobber with a bamboo sword without actually ruining him. And so the teacher may well have you work around the house doing various chores as a sort of janitor when you begin in sword school, and will take every possible occasion to surprise you and hitting you with a bamboo sword. And you're expected to defend yourself with anything available, with the cushion, with the broom, with a saucepan, anything you happen to be handling. Defend yourself immediately. Well, after a while, you know, if you're going around your everyday work expecting to be jumped on any minute, it becomes rather nerve-wracking. Especially if you're thinking all the time about where's it going to come from next. And you discover that the more you make plans and try to calculate on where it's going to hit you next, you will always be outwitted. Because the teacher is infinitely clever and will always come from an unexpected direction. So at last there arrives a point where you just give up. You stop planning. And you just go around relaxed, and if it hits, it hits. And then you're ready to start fencing. Then you begin regular lessons. Because you have given up protecting yourself. And therefore you've learnt real defense. Because you can't protect yourself by calculation, by one-pointed thinking of one thing at a time, against an enemy who may attack from an infinite number of directions. Another story told about this is the story of the woodcutter and the animal, whose name was Satori. There was once a woodcutter working in a clearing in a forest, when he saw a strange animal peeking at him from behind a bush. And thinking to have this animal for dinner, he rushed at it with his axe. And the animal laughed from the opposite side of the clearing. Because this animal had the power to read thoughts. And therefore, wherever the woodsman intended to go, the animal read his thought first. And so the animal began to talk and mocked him and said, "You think you're going to do, I'm going to be this place next," because the woodsman naturally thought, when I see him next, instead of going to where he is, I'll go to the opposite side of the clearing. And so this went on until the woodsman got absolutely furious, and he returned to chopping the wood. And the animal laughed and said, "So you've given up." And just at that moment, as he whanged the axe against a tree, the head flew off and struck the animal dead. That's the way you have to attain Zen. So you see what happened here. The boy who studies swordsmanship is put in this impossible situation where he can't do anything right. Everything he does is wrong. And therefore, after finding this out, that nothing will do because it's all self-conscious, he gives up. Then he can be spontaneous. But you see what is provided is the training, why the training of Zen people is disciplined, is that we're going, first of all, to be spontaneous within limits. See, out in society, you can't do that. Because people will be just bugged by you if you say exactly what you feel and always act the truth. You won't be liked. And you may indeed do very dangerous things. But the Sodo, or the Zen training school, is set up so that it's a walled-in situation where one is allowed to be spontaneous within certain limits. And the crucial moment is what is called the Sanzen interview, which is a restricted interview. It's very formal. But in the climax of that interview, no holds are barred. It is a personal interchange where fundamental honesty is the crux of the whole thing. Now, you see, as I explained last time, that is a very buggy situation. Because the more you wonder whether you're going to be fundamentally honest, the more you get cold feet. Listen, supposing you were allowed an interview with God and allowed to ask one question, what would you ask? And really think it over, you know. If you go into this and think, what would I ask? You know, it's got to be really important. It's got to be the fundamental question for you. What is it that you basically want to know? And you start thinking about that and thinking about that. And the more you think about it, the more you don't know what you would ask. So you think, well, that's a silly question, isn't it? I know what he would say to that. And you think about another one and think, that's a curious, interesting question. I don't suppose anybody knows the answer to it. But after all, it's only just idle curiosity. I don't think I'll ask that one. Then you think of another question and think about that for a while, and then you realize it's a question that doesn't mean anything. That would be a waste of breath and of a great opportunity. And you go through it and through it and through it until you think about all the questions you might ask. It's the same, very much so, if you visit a great master. You know, you might get an interview with a Zen master while you're here, and with the advantage of an interpreter present. What are you going to ask him? You've got just this one chance. What do you want to know? I remember a friend of mine who went to Yamazaki Roshi, who used to be at Shikokuji. He said when he got in there, he said, you know, I feel so silly. He said, I haven't got any questions to ask you. I just feel like laughing. And Yamazaki said, good, let's laugh. He broke into a great bellow. And, you know, there it is. So it's a protected, this is what I want to emphasize about this, because there are ever so many facets of Zen that are so easily misunderstood just through reading about it. There's one school of people that will emphasize the spontaneity of it and think, gee, this Zen is real groovy stuff, you know, and it means you just do anything you like. It's true, you see, that certain of the great Zen masters have said Zen is, Rinzai made this point very strongly. He said, in Zen there is no place for discipline or for Buddhism or for making efforts. You just eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, move your bowels when nature calls. Fools will laugh at me, but the wise will understand. See, you read that. Next thing you know, somebody comes here to Japan to study Zen, and suddenly they write back letters about hours and hours of sitting in one position and being banged about with warning sticks and having to get up at the ghastly at 4 in the morning and wash in cold water and having a very spare diet and having to do things, behave and move just exactly so, and all that side of it is emphasized. Well, people think, what's going on? Is it this or is it that? Is it one thing or is it the other? The answer is it's both. It does have discipline, especially in view of the fact, and do bear this in mind, most Zen monks today are not really in the monastery of their own volition and have not been for hundreds of years. They've been there because it was a family tradition. If you see you have a son, you're a priest, and you have a son. Well, in all traditional cultures, in India, in China, and so on, there's a tendency for the son to carry on his father's business. So if you're the son of a priest, it's sort of expected that you'll be one too. So off to the monastery with you. It was the same in England in the 18th century, where the oldest son of the family went into the army, the second son into the law, I forget which order it was, and the third son anyway went into the ministry. Well, that means a whole lot of people who are in theological school haven't got the slightest interest in religion. Not real interest. And so they have to be taught to think. So St. Ignatius, for example, made out methods of meditation. A, B, C, D, proximate consideration, remote consideration, the meditation itself, the resolution at the end, and so on. This is simply designs to teach people how to think who had never thought and weren't interested in thinking. So in much the same way, these things have occurred in the Far East. And a great deal of it is therefore designed to discipline people who have no real motivation for the discipline in question, the study in question. So now, one of the great features of Zen training is to develop within yourself what is called a great doubt. And the koan system is used to develop a great doubt. Here you are, you're asked to hear the sound of one hand. And, if you're an American and you've come over to Japan to study Zen, you've gone to a lot of trouble. You obviously have some sincere motivation. And you just can't get the answer to that one hand thing. And it becomes more and more a matter of life and death because it seems terribly important to find this out. So you have a great doubt. That is to say, you have an urgent spirit of inquiry. And you can't get it, and you can't get it, and you can't get it. The teacher keeps saying, now, come on, let's go. Let's be ready to give your life for this thing. But you see, if you go into a Zen monastery, and you don't have that spirit of inquiry that led you across the ocean at a great deal of expense, you're just someone who was brought up, one of the boys in the neighborhood, and you went into the monastery. Although the teacher says the trouble with you is you don't have a great doubt. Of course he doesn't have a great doubt. He's not interested. So he learns to cultivate a great doubt. See, it's like trying to, if I may put it in Western or Christian terminology, you don't love God. You've never seen him. You don't know anything about God. Why the devil would you love God? Somebody comes along and say, you've got to love God, It's terribly important. It's the first commandment. Oh, gee, I've got to love God. So what do? We sit down and say, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you. Come on, you've got to get this feeling going. Get that going. And then the preacher can tell all sorts of stories, you see, and move you. He can terrify you with the fear of hell if you don't love God. Or he can say how beautiful Jesus was. That was the revelation of God. Now you ought to love that. You ought to love your mother. Probably hate her guts. So you see, you get this thing. Work on that great doubt. Well, you see, the trouble is you can't get a great doubt to order. You can't tell anybody anything to order. If you could, do you know what would happen? Supposing you go to music school. What are they trying to do in music school? They're trying to find methods for teaching creative musicianship. Whether you're a player or whether you're a composer or whatever. They want to find out how they can make every student a genius. Actually, all schools are run for the advantage of the staff. And it's a job. You've got to put people through there. It's a way of keeping them off the labor market. But if you're a very sincere teacher, you want to find out how to impart that subtle thing to the students. So there are books galore on methods, special methods for getting that creative ability across. Professor so-and-so's method, Dr. so-and-so's method, etc., playing the piano and so on. Make it easy, but make him a genius. Now, if such a method existed, do you know what would happen? These geniuses would all be boring, because we would know how they do it. And the whole fascination of an art and of a great performance is you don't know how it's done. There must be something about it that is fundamentally astonishing. You could say, again, putting it into Western terms, if God could explain how he created the universe, he wouldn't be God. And you know how in the book of Genesis, it's told so straightforwardly that when the Lord first of all creates the things, and then looks at them afterwards and sees that they're good. And I love the passage where suddenly he creates great whales. Suddenly great whales, whoops, like that. And he looks at these things and says, my, that's great, do it again. And so in this way, there's a Zen poem which says, you may want to ask where the flowers come from, but even the god of spring doesn't know. And another says, planting flowers to which the butterflies come, Bodhidharma says, I don't know. There was another occasion when an officer of the army came to a Zen master and said, sir, I've heard a very strange story and I want to know your answer to it. Once upon a time there was a man who kept a goose in a bottle, and it grew so large that he couldn't get it out. Now, he didn't want to break the bottle and he didn't want to hurt the goose, so how does he get it out? And the master changed the subject and said something like, it's a nice day today, isn't it? And the waterfall making a lovely sound outside. And so they went on in pleasant conversation. And then the officer got up to leave, and as he walked away to the door, the master said, oh, officer! And he turned around and said, yes? And the master said, there, it's out. Another time, there was a famous master called Suibi, and he was asked, what is the secret teaching of Buddhism? And he was asked this in the lecture hall, where other monks were studying. And he said, wait till there's no one around and I'll tell you. So later in the day, the monk accosted him and said, there's nobody around now. What is the secret teaching of Buddhism? So he went into the garden with this monk and he pointed at the bamboos. And the monk said, I don't understand. He said, what a tall one that is, what a short one that is. And this awakened the monk. Then there was another monk whose name was Gute. And whenever people came to ask him question about Buddhism, he'd hold up a finger. That was the only answer he'd give. Well, he had an attendant. And one day somebody came to the temple to inquire about the teaching being given there, and the master was apparently out, and his attendant was there. So the investigator said, what is your teaching here? And the attendant held up a finger. Went away, but actually the master had been there. He was peeking from behind a screen. And so he came out to this boy and said, what's the fundamental teaching of Buddhism? And the boy held up a finger. Instantly the master drew a knife and cut it off. And the boy was very dismayed and rushed away yelling. So the master said, hey, come back! As he came back, he said, what's the fundamental principle of Buddhism? And he went to hold up the finger and it wasn't there. And he was enlightened. There is a Chinese god whose name is Pingting, and this is the god of fire. And there was a monk who was traveling, and he came to a new master. He had been to someone else, and he said, well, who did you study with before you came to me? Or he said, I studied with so-and-so. He said, what did he teach you? Well, he said, when I asked about the fundamental meaning of Buddhism, he answered me, Ping-ting comes for fire. Well, the master said, that was an excellent answer, but I bet you didn't understand it. Oh, yes, he said, I understood it, because Ping-ting is the god of fire. And when, if Ping-ting should ask for fire, that would be like me asking about Buddhism, because I'm really a Buddha already. The master shook his head. I said, I knew it. He said, you missed the point completely. Well, he said, well, how would you deal with it? The master said, you asked me. So the monk said, what is the fundamental principle of Buddhism? And the master said, Ping-ting comes for fire. And the monk got the point. Well, you can go on with these stories indefinitely. And But you'll notice certain dynamics in them. They require, as a rule, a solution to a dilemma. Or they do something that creates what we would call a state of blockage. When you're posed with something completely unusual, and you don't know how to react to it in a normal, automatic way. You see, if somebody says to you in the street, "Good morning," you say "Good morning," and you're not being spontaneous, you're being merely automatic. But when somebody comes up to you and says, "Are you saved? Or do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior?" It's a very unusual question, and it stalls most people. They say, "Well, what do you mean?" Or something funny like that, or they feel embarrassed by religious questions. And, or somebody might say to you, "Why have you got such long toenails?" When you're wearing a shoe and nobody can see it, you see. Anything that absolutely disrupts the normal flow of interchange. Well, then you're nonplussed. And the object of Zen is never to be nonplussed. That's, you see, to be nonplussed is the real meaning of the Buddhist doctrine of what's called bonno in Japanese, which means entanglements or defilements, or attachments, we might call them. Worldly attachments. It is not a worldly attachment in Buddhist philosophy to enjoy dinner. That is natural, you see. It is not a worldly attachment to need to sleep. That is perfectly natural. But it is worldly attachment to be sticky. That's to say, to be like a wheel that sticks on the axle and squeaks. So we are sticky when we are in a certain way self-conscious. We are, as we would say, all balled up or all clutched up. And we've lost our original spontaneity. And we are not, as it were, flowing with the stream of the Tao, the course of nature, or whatever you want to call it. So then all these questions put you in a dilemma. And the point is to see if you can get out of the dilemma without a moment's hesitation. That doesn't mean doing it quickly, necessarily, because if you're in a hurry to give a quick answer, that itself is a form of blockage. You should all read in this connection a translation in Suzuki's book Zen and Japanese Culture of a letter written by Takuan, who invented pickled radishes. I told you about, those yellow daikons are called Takuan after this man. And he wrote a letter on the art of swordsmanship, where he explains the necessity of spontaneity in fencing is that if you have to stop to think about how you're going to respond to a certain kind of attack, it's too late. You'll be dead. You must respond in the same way as when you clap the hands, the sound comes out without a moment's hesitation. Or when you strike steel on flint, there is no waiting before the spark comes out. But he adds, if you try to be quick, this will itself be a block. So when, you may know this, that when people are trained in the use of the sword, they get what Anne Clark bought the other day, which is a bamboo sword to start with. And you can give a person a healthy clobber with a bamboo sword without actually ruining him. And so the teacher may well have you work around the house doing various chores as a sort of janitor when you begin in sword school, and will take every possible occasion to surprise you and hitting you with a bamboo sword. And you're expected to defend yourself with anything available, with the cushion, with the broom, with a saucepan, anything you happen to be handling. Defend yourself immediately. Well, after a while, if you're going around your everyday work expecting to be jumped on any minute, it becomes rather nerve-wracking. Especially if you're thinking all the time about where's it going to come from next. And you discover that the more you make plans, and try to calculate on where it's going to hit you next, you will always be outwitted. Because the teacher is infinitely clever and will always come from an unexpected direction. So at last there arrives a point where you just give up. You stop planning. And you just go around relaxed, and if it hits, it hits. And then you're ready to start fencing. Then you begin regular lessons. Because you have given up protecting yourself. And therefore you've learnt real defense. Because you can't protect yourself by calculation, by one-pointed thinking of one thing at a time, against an enemy who may attack from an infinite number of directions. Another story told about this is the story of the woodcutter and the animal whose name was Satori. There was once a woodcutter working in a clearing in a forest when he saw a strange animal peeking at him from behind a bush. And thinking to have this animal for dinner, he rushed at it with his axe. And the animal laughed from the opposite side of the clearing. Because this animal had the power to read thoughts. And therefore, wherever the woodsman intended to go, the animal read his thought first. And so the animal began to talk and mocked him and said, "You think I'm going to be this place next," because the woodsman naturally thought, when I see him next, instead of going to where he is, I'll go to the opposite side of the clearing. And so this went on until the woodsman got absolutely furious, and he returned to chopping the wood. And the animal laughed and said, "So you've given up." And just at that moment, as he whanged the axe against a tree, the head flew off and struck the animal dead. That's the way you have to attain Zen. So you see what happened here. The boy who studies swordsmanship is put in this impossible situation where he can't do anything right. Everything he does is wrong. And therefore, after finding this out, that nothing will do because it's all self-conscious, he gives up. Then he can be spontaneous. But you see what is provided is the training, why the training of Zen people is disciplined, is that we're going, first of all, to be spontaneous within limits. See, out in society, you can't do that. Because people will be just bugged by you if you say exactly what you feel and always act the truth. You won't be liked. And you may indeed do very dangerous things. But the Sodo, or the Zen training school, is set up so that it's a walled-in situation where one is allowed to be spontaneous within certain limits. And the crucial moment is what is called the Sanzen interview, which is a restricted interview. It's very formal. But in the climax of that interview, no holds are barred. It is a personal interchange where fundamental honesty is the crux of the whole thing. Now, you see, as I explained last time, that is a very buggy situation. Because the more you wonder whether you're going to be fundamentally honest, the more you get cold feet. Listen, supposing you were allowed an interview with God and allowed to ask one question, what would you ask? And really think it over, you know. If you go into this and think, what would I ask? You know, it's got to be really important. It's got to be the fundamental question for you. What is it that you basically want to know? And you start thinking about that and thinking about that. And the more you think about it, the more you don't know what you would ask. So you think, well, that's a silly question, isn't it? I know what he would say to that. And you think about another one and think, that's a curious, interesting question. I don't suppose anybody knows the answer to it. But after all, it's only just idle curiosity. I don't think I'll ask that one. Then you think of another question and think about that for a while, and then you realize it's a question that doesn't mean anything. That would be a waste of breath. and of a great opportunity. And you go through it and through it and through it until you think about all the questions you might ask. It's the same, very much so, if you visit a great master. You might get an interview with a Zen master while you're here, and with the advantage of an interpreter present. What are you going to ask him? You've got just this one chance. What do you want to know? I remember a friend of mine who went to Yamazaki Roshi, who used to be at Shokokuji. He said when he got in there, he said, I feel so silly. He said, I haven't got any questions to ask you. I just feel like laughing. And Yamazaki said, good, let's laugh. He broke into a great bellow. And, there it is. So it's a protected, this is what I want to emphasize about this, because there are ever so many facets of Zen that are so easily misunderstood just through reading about it. There's one school of people that will emphasize the spontaneity of it. And think, gee, this Zen is real groovy stuff, and it means you just do anything you like. It's true, you see, that certain of the great Zen masters have said Zen is, Rinzai made this point very strongly. He said, in Zen there is no place for discipline, or for Buddhism, or for making efforts. You just eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, move your bowels when nature calls. Fools will laugh at me, but the wise will understand. See, you read that. Next thing you know, somebody comes here to Japan to study Zen, and suddenly they write back letters about hours and hours of sitting in one position and being banged about with warning sticks and having to get up at the ghastly 4 a.m. and wash in cold water, and having a very spare diet, and having to do things, behave and move just exactly so, and all that side of it is emphasized. Well, people think, what's going on? Is it this or is it that? Is it one thing or is it the other? The answer is it's both. It does have discipline, especially in view of the fact, and do bear this in mind, most Zen monks today are not really in the monastery of their own volition, and have not been for hundreds of years. They've been there because it was a family tradition. If you see you have a son, you're a priest, and you have a son. Well, in all traditional cultures, in India, in China, and so on, there's a tendency for the son to carry on his father's business. So if you're the son of a priest, it's sort of expected that you'll be one too. So off to the monastery with you. It was the same in England in the 18th century, where the oldest son of the family went into the army, the second son into the law, I forget which order it was, and the third son anyway went into the ministry. Well, that means a whole lot of people who are in theological school haven't got the slightest interest in religion. Not real interest. And so they have to be taught to think. So St. Ignatius, for example, made out methods of meditation. A, B, C, D, proximate consideration, remote consideration, the meditation itself, the resolution at the end, and so on. This is simply designs to teach people how to think who had never thought and weren't interested in thinking. So in much the same way, these things have occurred in the Far East. And a great deal of it is therefore designed to discipline people who have no real motivation for the discipline in question, the study in question. So now, one of the great features of Zen training is to develop within yourself what is called a great doubt. And the koan system is used to develop a great doubt. Here you are, you're asked to hear the sound of one hand. And, if you're an American and you've come over to Japan to study Zen, you've gone to a lot of trouble. You obviously have some sincere motivation. And you just can't get the answer to that one hand thing. And it becomes more and more a matter of life and death, because it seems terribly important to find this out. So you have a great doubt. That is to say, you have an urgent spirit of inquiry. And you can't get it, and you can't get it, and you can't get it. The teacher keeps saying, now, come on, let's go. Let's be ready to give your life for this thing. But you see, if you go into a Zen monastery, and you don't have that spirit of inquiry that led you across the ocean at a great deal of expense, you're just someone who was brought up, one of the boys in the neighborhood, and you went into the monastery. Although the teacher says the trouble with you is you don't have a great doubt. Of course he doesn't have a great doubt. He's not interested. So he learns to cultivate a great doubt. See, it's like trying to, if I may put it in Western or Christian terminology, you don't love God. You've never seen him. You don't know anything about God. Why the devil would you love God? Somebody comes along and says, you've got to love God, It's terribly important. It's the first commandment. Oh, gee, I've got to love God. So what do? We sit down and say, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you, dear God, I love you. Come on, I've got to get this feeling going, get that going. And then the preacher can tell all sorts of stories, you see, and move you. He can terrify you with the fear of hell if you don't love God. Or he can say how beautiful Jesus was. That was the revelation of God. Now you ought to love that. You ought to love your mother. Probably hate her guts. So you see, you get this thing. Work on that great doubt. Well, you see, the trouble is you can't get a great doubt to order. You can't tell anybody anything to order. If you could, do you know what would happen? Supposing you go to music school. What are they trying to do in music school? They're trying to find methods for teaching creative musicianship. Whether you're a player or whether you're a composer or whatever. They want to find out how they can make every student a genius. Actually, all schools are run for the advantage of the staff. And it's a job. You've got to put people through there. It's a way of keeping them off the labor market. But if you're a very sincere teacher, you want to find out how to impart that subtle thing to the students. So there are books galore on methods, special methods for getting that creative ability across. Professor so-and-so's method, Dr. so-and-so's method, etc., playing the piano and so on. Make it easy, but make him a genius. Now, if such a method existed, do you know what would happen? These geniuses would all be boring, because we would know how they do it. And the whole fascination of an art and of a great performance is you don't know how it's done. There must be something about it that is fundamentally astonishing. You could say, again, putting it into Western terms, if God could explain how he created the universe, he wouldn't be God. And you know how in the book of Genesis, it's told so straightforwardly that when the Lord first of all creates the things, and then looks at them afterwards and sees that they're good. And I love the passage where suddenly he creates great whales. Suddenly great whales, whoops, like that. And he looks at these things and says, my, that's great, do it again. And so in this way, there's a Zen poem which says, you may want to ask where the flowers come from, but even the god of spring doesn't know. And another says, planting flowers to which the butterflies come, Bodhidharma says, I don't know. So there is this curious thing in all what I would call vital knowledge, living knowledge, that it's always a mystery to itself. Life is a mystery to itself. For the same reason, you see, there's a Zen poem which says, it is like a sword that cuts but does not cut itself, like an eye that sees but does not see itself. So in this way, what there is fundamentally, basic reality, knows itself and doesn't know itself. If it did know itself thoroughly, it would stop. Like playing games. If you know the outcome of a game for sure, there's no point playing it. So, when master chess players sit down and it becomes apparent, although there are still many pieces on the board, that one of them is going to mate in 3 moves, they abandon the game because they know the outcome. If you knew the future perfectly, if you knew everything you're going to do right up to the day of your death, you'd say, let's check out on this game. Let's commit suicide and start another life. Because there's no point living through what is known completely. Of course, you can't very well live through what is unknown completely. There must be some light. But total light annihilates itself. So then you see there is no prescription, and no infallible technique for teaching anybody music, although there are music schools. And there is likewise no infallible technique for teaching anybody Zen, although indeed there are Zen schools. And sometimes the teacher, who is many years experienced, begins to get disillusioned. What's the point of all these schools? What's the point of teaching music? You can't teach music. You could only pass it on from one person to another by osmosis. Sure, there's a technique. You can learn how to read. You can learn how to put your fingers on the banjo or something. But the real thing, what to do with that technique, what to say with it, you can't teach that. So one assumes then that a person who is sufficiently motivated, who is fond of music, will learn the technique because he wants to get so where he can handle the instruments. And you suppose likewise that a person who is really interested in self-knowledge, after all Zen is only a certain way of self-knowledge, will master certain techniques because he's interested. But you see, all schools and all systems begin to make techniques an end in themselves because technique is the only thing you can teach. You can't teach the thing. Now, you see, we get scared when we think of that. We say, do you mean to say I might be that person who gets hung up in this, and all I'm going to get out of this school is technique? Somehow I might be that dumb bunny who just doesn't get the thing? That's an awful thought, isn't it? Because that's drilled into us from childhood. For example, it comes out in toilet training. I remember all medical and nursing authorities, when I was a small boy, had tremendous constipation phobia. And they believed that you could suffer from poisoning, from retaining things too long. And so they were always agitating, questioning every day as to whether you had been. So you built up, conversely, a terror that you might not be able to. And this, in its turn, built up tensions that were actually constipating. And so everybody was constantly being filled with cascara sagrada, California syrup of figs, castor oil, bombshells of every description, which upset the natural functioning. So, in the same way, you might think, I'm going to practice meditations or something and study Zen, but will I be the poor fool who never gets the point? You could put it in Christian terms and say, I will be as good as I can be, but perhaps I will be the one who God will never give any real grace to, because I haven't been picked out. And will I get this grace? There's no way, you see, that you can wangle grace. You can't compel the Lord to give it. The same way you can't compel Satori to happen. So you think, maybe it won't happen to me. So that's possible, you see. So what do you do about that? Well, the teachers have all sorts of things to say about what to do about it. They say, well, now look, just forget about it. It doesn't matter if you don't get it. Not getting it is getting it, you see. They use this paradox all the time. Not to have it, really to accept that you don't have it. That's getting it. That's the real point. See? But that's a gimmick. See, I'm going to try as hard as I can not to try to get it. See? But you're really playing a game. See? You know that this is I've at last got the infallible method. There must be an infallible method, because if there isn't a method, we are lost, we are up the creek. Why? Because we're out of control. But you see, when you find out there isn't a method, there isn't a positive method, and there isn't a negative method, what are you going to do? You can't do something, and you can't do nothing. You can't let go of the thing, because after all you got curious about it. And this is what's called having swallowed a ball of hot iron. You can't gulp it down and you can't spit it out. And Zen is a trap to get you into that state. You be very careful how you get mixed up with the thing. Because, you may end up in a padded cell blathering. But that is the quandary it is, and that's why ever so many opposite things can be said about Zen. That's why on the one hand it can be said rightly that it's a strong discipline. Why on the other hand it can be said rightly that it's not a discipline at all. And it isn't that it's just a mixture of things. Zen isn't sort of partly discipline and partly spontaneity. Whatever is said about it can be said of all of it. And therefore it seems to be paradoxical. And one always can get into difficulty by neglecting some side of it and saying, well, that doesn't matter. Sometimes it's true that it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's not true. It may be just the thing that you need, the side you say that doesn't matter. So there's no way, what I'm trying to say is, there's no way of putting your finger on this thing. There's no way of nailing it down, and that's the whole point. Because you see, fundamentally, Zen makes you do what you were doing all the time, only it makes you do it consistently. Let's supposing you're sitting in your padded cell, and you suddenly found out this little game. See, you've got your one hand clasped by the other and your thumb sticking out here at the top. And you look at that thumb and say, ooh, look at that. Whoops! I'm going to try to catch it. No. Got it. No. No. Here we go. No. No. Come on. Let's get it. Come on. Let's get it. Come on. Let's get it. Get that thing. Get that. See? Whew, that's what we're doing. See? Here's me. And here's knowing about me. No, I want to and control myself, you see. I want to get hold of that thing that's me. Because when I get hold of it, I can control it. Then I'm going to be all right. I've got to get hold of it. Yesterday afternoon, I was discussing the plausibility of two essential features of the philosophy of illusion. The question that we have to decide whether to take life seriously or not, that is to say, whether the plot is comic or tragic. And if it's tragic, you see, must we say that it's ultimately tragic? And the question of who are you? And are we to say that I myself, right down at root, am just a little kind of jerk of some kind that really has nothing to do with this cosmos, but just arises in it and is here on sufferance for a short period and then absolutely nothing follows, you see. Or the alternative to that is what I really am, the same as the whole thing, that is, the works, the it, or whatever you want to call it, Brahman, God, the Tao, the great void, the Buddha nature, I don't care, the self, anything, any name you want. And whereas that attitude, you can look at it from various points of view in judging it. You can say it's wishful thinking. You can say that it's insufferable pride. But the point of the matter is, as I tried to show, any other way of looking at things is kind of schizoid. It looks at human beings as if they arrived in this world like a bunch of birds on the branches of a barren tree. And they just got settled there, they don't belong. The sense of being strangers and pilgrims from another domain altogether. Well, where is this other domain? And how does it relate to this one? Are they separate? I showed you that even when we say that two domains are the poles apart, the very fact that they're poles shows that they have a hidden connection. And the hidden connection is the big thing in life. All you junkies know that. And so, in other words, we get a pattern of organization that is radial rather than an assemblage, as if the universe were really a multiverse. A lot of things that got collected together out of the infinite wastes of space and sort of began to maunder around each other. Whereas the other pattern, which is so much more sensible, is central and radial, and I showed you how the crystals and the stars and the octopuses and even the human beings are all radial structures. Of course, we don't see our radial relationship to the totality of the universe because it isn't obvious. It's obvious that a tree is an arm of the earth reaching up and waving at the sky, and a mountain is another kind of radiation from the earth, and so is a leg from a body, and hair, and things like that. But what makes human beings, as the highest of the mammals, so conscious of being independent is that they are topologically an enclosed surface, you see, which wanders around independently of the ground. What we don't notice is that we are not independent of the ground at all, that wandering around is something that is entirely related to there being some ground. In other words, when you run up a hill, the hill also runs you up it. The hill rises and lifts you as you run, you see? And if you understand that, you don't take a hostile attitude to mountains and hills. You're grateful to them for lifting you up so high in the air, because that's presumably why you went up, that the thing was high. It was lifted up. You wanted to be lifted up. It lifted you up. You had to cooperate, of course. I always like the illustration that I've used before, perhaps you haven't heard it, of the thistledown. The thistledown, too, comes moving through the sky. I once was playing with the thing, and it just came out of the blue sky, and I caught it like that, pulled it under my nose, and it started to pull to get away. See, it looks as if it were a butterfly or something that pulls away when you catch it by the leg. And I thought, oh no, of course, that's not the thistledown, it's the wind. Well, which was it? You know, in a famous debate that was settled by the sixth patriarch of Zen, there were two monks arguing when a flag was flapping in the wind whether it was the wind or the flag that was moving. And he said, it's neither, it's the mind. And so in a way the same thing was true about the thistledown. The mind is the moving thing, because which point of view will you take? Which attitude of mind will you take towards this? Is it the wind moving the thistledown? Or is it the thistledown that is moving itself with the wind? After all, when you see a sailing boat, and there's a man in the sailing boat, who is moving the boat? Is it the wind moving the boat, or is it the man moving the boat because he was smart enough to put up a sail? Much smarter way of getting around than rowing. You don't have to work. It's intelligence, you see, the mind that moves the boat. And so in the same way, I thought, this thistledown has some kind of intelligence. It's radial, it's organized, it's beautiful, and it's used that to sail itself with the wind, to enable itself to pull like a little organism playing with the wind. And so in just the same way, each one of us uses the universe to get around, and the universe uses us to play with, and to make games and patterns, and to do its stuff. So, because we seem to be disconnected and entirely sealed within our skin, that is a very deceptive thing, because the skin is not really the boundary of man. You'll notice that in various periods of art, human beings have been shaped in different ways. And have been more or less transparent at some times, at other times opaque, and sometimes the emphasis has been on the state of mind which this human being is in. At other times the emphasis is on the bodily conformations and so on. In the work of painters today, one sees images that at first sight one doesn't recognize as being human. There was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York some years ago called The New Image of Man. And these things didn't look like human beings at all. Some of them did, but that's because what does a human being look like? That depends on your point of view. You see, if you are prejudiced that a human being is only what is inside his skin, then you think that when anybody paints the human being beyond those boundaries, that he's lost the image of man. He hasn't necessarily lost it at all. You see, there's an old feeling that the shape of the universe is the shape of man. I don't know if you've ever heard that said. That man is the microcosm, and that the universe as a whole is the macrocosm. Now, as you plumb out into the universe and explore it astronomically, it gets very strange. You begin to see things in the depths that at first sight seem utterly remote. How could they have anything to do with us? They are so far off and so unlikely. And in the same way, when you start probing into the inner workings of the human body, you come across all kinds of funny little monsters and wiggly things that bear no resemblance to what we recognize as the human image. Look at a spermatozoon under a microscope, that little tadpole. And how can that have any connection with a grown human being? It's so unlike, you see. It's foreign feeling. And you get the creeps sometimes, the foreign feeling about yourself, if you feel your own pulse. Or if you're able to look at an X-ray in some way of your inner organs working. See, they're all strangers to us. We don't know about them. And they give us the creeps as if they were, coming across some weird insects in the dark. That sort of feeling. But what we will always find out in the end, you see, when we meet the very strange thing and we look into the distant reaches of space, there will one day be the dawning recognition, that's me. Why, that's me. And the whole game of the universe, you see, is to appear as strange to itself as it possibly can. That's how one keeps variety going. That's how one keeps wonder going, and all kinds of exciting developments. How different can you get? In the beginning, the Lord said, get lost, to himself, you see. So, we shall find, for example, that space that you see all around you and containing you. And you can feel space in many ways. Space is not only something that comes through the eyes. The movement of your arms, if with closed eyes, if for a blind person, is his way of knowing space. And you can hear space audibly. Lots of sounds appear to be in restricted spaces or ample spaces. And silence that goes with sound corresponds to space. And even St. Thomas Aquinas, that old Catholic theologian, said that good derives its virtue from evil, just as it is the silent pause that gives sweetness to the chant. So, but space, you see, that seems to contain, space is one's mind. This was common sense to people living in the early Renaissance, for example, at the time of Dante. There are many references in Dante's poetry to the identity of mind and space. And likewise in a 8th century text in China, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, he likens the nature of mind to the nature of space. He says, just as space contains all the sun and the moon and the stars and the people and the mountains and the forests, so the nature of mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of oneself contains all these things. So you see that if you think that way, you have an image of man that is global, that is very different from the image in which man is defined as bounded by his skin. That's a prejudice. We think now, for example, I have my own private thoughts. Well, nobody has private thoughts. Because one thinks in images and words, and these words and images are derived from the whole thought structure of the society in which you live. We think thoughts. The domain of mind is very similar to the grid structure of an electric power supply system. You know, what happens is there's a network of power stations and transformers so arranged that if one of them gives out and fails to supply a certain area, immediately the grid connects them with other sources of power. Well, in rather a similar way, our minds are connected. Let's take one very obvious example of it. What Northrop Frye calls the order of words. The order of words is all existing literature, both rhetoric, what is spoken, of course, and what is written down. Now, it's his theory that as a scholar of literature and the history of literature, he can take any piece of writing of a reasonable length and tell you when it was written. Because everything that is written and said is inescapably related to the whole order of words. And it's amazing what little things you might not notice would give you away. Because he can say, well, obviously he has read this, thinking, say, of a particular novelist or poet. So it must come after the date when that novel was published. But he couldn't possibly use an expression like that to say, for example, that it was a capital day. He would never use that expression living, say, in contemporary 20th century America. That's a Victorianism, or it's an Edwardian way of talking. And so by all sorts of little clues like that, the scholar can pin down a piece of writing to when it was written, you see. That is because every individual piece of writing is a function of all writing that's being done. Well, now that's a very specific and almost crude illustration of something that's going on in a far more complicated way than that. It isn't only all writing, all thinking is being done in relation to the total order of thought. And in a still more subtle way, all living is being done in relation to the total order of life, to what de Slowdown calls the biosphere, and it goes way beyond that, because of the vast interplay of what we now call gravitational and electrical fields, which embrace everything that there is. That is why the ancients, when a person was born, cast his horoscope. That was a map of the universe at the time of that person's birth. And therefore it was a drawing of his soul. Because the soul is not inside the body. The body is inside the soul. The soul, your soul, is the whole universe as it is focused upon your organism. Now, of course, astrology is a very primitive science, and it interpreted the influence of the universe upon the individual in very crude ways, and it works mostly by good guesswork on the part of the astrologer. If you know how to tell fortunes at a fair, you will find out a great deal about how all these predictive psychic sciences work, because the client invariably gives himself away. Either by his anxiety to be told the truth or by his anxiety to conceal it. They work equally well. Now, but there is, you see, underneath the astrological notion, a sound idea that the true map of the soul is the picture of the universe surrounding the individual. It isn't necessarily your soul is not the picture of the universe just at the moment when you were born, you see. It goes along all the time you live, because the whole thing expresses itself through you. And therefore, in that sense, the map of the stars, the horoscope, etc., was an image of man in just the same way as we regard a picture of the human body as an image of man. And it's an image from a different point of view. It's a bigger image. It shows, in other words, that your mind is very largely outside your body. After all, it's inside too. It's simultaneous. You see, I cannot think, I can't have a mind without seeing, feeling, and relating to other people. Without all the social institutions, not only language, but the laws, the customs, the gestures, the rituals by which we relate to each other. All those things compose the mind. For the mind is a huge network of relationships and interconnections at a high level of sensitivity. Mind and matter are, of course, polar. They go together. They're two ways of thinking about the same thing, or shall we say two dimensions of the same thing, just like length and breadth, or just, shall we say, like shape and color. You see, nobody ever saw a shape that wasn't colored. Nobody ever saw a color that wasn't shaped. And yet we can see there's a very clear difference between color and shape. But they always go together, they're always found together. Well, it's the same sort of relationship between mind and matter. And the difficulty that people have in trying to reduce one to the other, and saying, well, the world is only material, or saying, on the other hand, that it's only mental, is the same difference you would have in trying to reduce all shapes to colors, or all colors to shapes. Shape and color are made for each other, like a marriage made in heaven. They go together so perfectly, and yet stay so marvelously different. That's why the Buddhists say, difference is identity. Identity is difference. It sounds goofy, but it makes a great deal of sense, because what it's saying is a relational thing. That you don't know what identity is unless you know what difference is, and you don't know what difference is unless you know what identity is. that relationship between so-called opposites is called in the Chinese technical Taoist vocabulary mutual arising. So they say to be and not to be arise mutually. High and low are mutually posited. Long and short are mutually delineated, and so on. Now, what we see then is the totality of the cosmos focused at each point, you see, gives rise to the illusion of the independence of the point from the whole. Just as the human being, by virtue of having an enclosed epidermis, and to be able to walk instead of having to be rooted to the ground, presents the illusion of being separate. And so that's why I asked Vada to do these demonstrations last night, because he showed visually the interdependence of the figure and the background, and how the two play together, how you can switch from paying attention to one to paying attention to the other, and in each case it's significant. That is an art that we have lost in our day-to-day perception of life, and it leads, practically speaking, to the serious problem of ecological blindness. That is to say, to the ignorance which most human beings seem to suffer from, especially in our culture, that they are inseparably related to their physical environment. It looks as if we aren't. It looks as if we can go out with bulldozers and insecticides and every kind of a gadget and make over our physical environment as it suits our whims. But then we discover to our consternation that we've upset all sorts of balances, that the house we made such a nice flat lot for on the hillside suddenly slides down the hill when there's a rainstorm because we took away all the shrubbery that was binding the hill together. And, you know, this happens in Hollywood every day. And, and nobody ever seems to learn. And that's, you see, this immense importance of overcoming the illusion of separateness. But people are afraid of that because they think it's communistic. They think that the grand style, the great thing about Western civilization, is its stress on individual personality and its value. And that we have created the ideal of personal integrity. That is to say that the most important thing in the world is the individual. All collectivities, corporations, states, and so on, exist as servants of the individual. And if they get in his way and they interfere with his private enterprise, whatever that may be, it's a bad thing. Man, the individual, is the crown of creation from this point of view. And therefore, when anybody suggests that individual man is not what you thought was an individual, but is in some way united with, grounded in the totality, then if you're this kind of rugged individualist, you mix up your vocabulary and you call the totality the collective. Now, the collective and the totality are two completely different things. The idea of collectivism is based on individualism. It's the idea that the society of mankind and the physical environment beyond it is a collection with nothing of the kind. That's the idea of cosmic flotsam and jetsam that all floated together into a collection. And that's the obverse of individualism. You know, American individualism is the same philosophy as Marxist collectivism, seen from the other side, because they're both based on the same erroneous sensation of individuality. Now, what people don't understand is that a complex and interesting personality is not a matter of being isolated. It's a matter of being deeply connected with and aware of one's relationship to the whole surrounding cosmos. Let's suppose that I'm preparing to make a date with some lady, and she's such an individualist that her thoughts are only occupied with herself. She never thinks about anything that isn't herself. Well, she's an awful bore. She has nothing to say. She's not interested in any books, in any landscapes, in any works of art, in any literature, in any other people. She's a total bore. But the more, on the other hand, she would be interested in all those things that are supposed to be not herself, the more of a colorful personality she becomes. So the rule is to get away, you see, from these ideas of the individual as finding his individuality and uniqueness through independence, but rather finding his individuality and uniqueness through being related. Because, you see, that's what makes us look at the word relation from another point of view when we talk about our friends and relations. Supposing I come across some individual who I can't make out what kind of a thing he is. I can't make out where he came from. His accent isn't American, it isn't British. It isn't particularly Middle Western, it certainly doesn't have the overtones of New York or New England. He just talks flat. And as to his style of clothing, it's utterly nondescript. Well, I think this is pretty much of a bore. What I like to see in an individuality, in a physical individual, is ways that I can relate him to his ancestry. That he has this little subtle accent, or this mannerism, or this eccentricity, or whatever it is that connects him with a great background, you see? But it's his connection with his background that makes him so significant. If I can't see that connection, he becomes uninteresting. So, there is no thought in this approach to devalue the individual. What really does devalue the individual is any kind of religious or political philosophy that overstresses his isolation. And this is something that Californians in particular need to take note of. And because many people feel, you see, that the development of technology and of centralized government is a direct threat to the value of personality. Well, in some ways it is. But that is only because technology is being developed by personalities who don't understand what personality is. They're working on the old individualist -- collectivist point of view. They're the same. So then, you see, this is then the illusion created that the individual is operating all by himself, that actions and thoughts and deeds proceed solely from inside his skin, so that we can say, there's where it started. You see? Well, that's the game of praising and blaming, the game of who started it, who can we give candy to, who can we bang on the head. In other words, somebody has to be it. As in The Farmer in the Dell, you know, and finally you get the end, the cheese stands alone, the cheese stands alone. Hi-ho the dairy-o, the cheese stands alone. Well, why? Who started it? The group. Well, another fear about this is that it absolves people of responsibility if they see through the illusion of separateness. The truth of the matter is, actually, that no philosophy of history has really succeeded in making anybody more or less responsible. In other words, let's say that you are a Christian, a Catholic of the old-fashioned medieval type, who believes that you've got an individual soul with free will and that you're under responsibility to God to obey His law, and that if you don't, the most disastrous consequences imaginable will befall you. You will fry in hell forever. There's no evidence whatsoever that believing in that made people any more virtuous than they are today. None at all. Indeed, clergy who believed in all this owned whorehouses and all kinds of things. They were just as contemptuous of law and order as anybody could be now. And part of the reason was, of course, that the threat of hell was an unimaginable penalty like the H-bomb. It's just too big to think about, and really brings justice into disrespect because it uses such crude and clumsy methods. You know, it's like using a steam hammer to drive in tacks. Responsibility is a thing like a nice face, which you either have or haven't. Certain backgrounds, certain interests, certain awarenesses of relationship create responsibility in some human beings. And they live that way not because they are giving themselves sermons and telling themselves all the time that they ought to be responsible. It's because they're intelligent enough to see that being responsible makes things very much easier for everybody all round. That's all there is to it. And, of course, that's all is a big all, but you won't, what I'm saying is, the people who are frightened that other people will abandon responsibility never did have any way of thinking that would guarantee that people would be responsible. There is no such guarantee. If there were, we should be automata. Now, I want to switch to another aspect of illusion. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. And that is, of course, the great illusion of what we call matter. Density, impenetrability, opacity. I find it hard to talk about the illusion of matter because I'm a materialist. That is to say, I like material. And though I may seem to you to be quite self-contradictory. For example, a wine should have body. Pure alcohol doesn't. And it's terribly important in human character for there to be a blend of materialism and mysticism, between sensuality and spirituality. You see, people who are purely sensuous and materialistic get very boring. You can fill your lives with all good things, with Alfa Romeos and hi-fis and wonderful cameras and girls with beautiful bodies and Chris Crafts and dry martinis and Chanel No. 5, you know. And after a while, if that's all you've got, it gets sickening and the bottoms begin to feel like plastic and the martinis taste like medicine, and, and somehow, you get a distaste for life, and even for mountains and trees and waters. And then on the other hand, the purely spiritual approach to things is too rarefied, too earnest, too abstract, too purely Euclidean. And the people who are intensely spiritual and don't have any sensuality are always desperately serious, colorless, lacking in humor, and never are able to meet one as man to man with a kind of a friendly leer in the eye. That's terribly important. Yes, they live at a level of frantic intensity. I see these two extremes need each other. Say spirituality needs a beer and a loud burp, and sensuality needs a rough blanket and a hard bed and a cold night with the stars, to wonder about. The sensualist as such, the materialist as such, has no wonder, and the mystic, the pure mystic, has no body. He's pure alcohol. Spirit. So, if then one should say that material is an illusion, this seems to be selling out to the spirit people and to the mystics. And so Christian scientists are, generally speaking, as personalities, totally lacking in materialism. They're prissy and lacking in color, and their churches are very, very disagreeable. They're all reading desks, and they're too bookish, and they have no ritual, no ceremonies, no verve, you see? It's all cerebral. And likewise, when people get the wrong idea about Hinduism or Buddhism, they go into this same ultra-mysticism. They start disbelieving in all material pleasures as crutches. And it's very bad to have crutches, you see. You shouldn't take aspirin when you've got a headache. You shouldn't wear glasses. You shouldn't show dependence on anything. You mustn't like your food too much, because that's becoming gluttonous. So you eat very plain food, which is not spiced, and you eat it out of a sense of duty. That is to keep the body functioning. You drink only water, because other drinks might cause certain dependencies and give you too much pleasure. And because the idea is, you see, you've got to control your mind and keep it absolutely calm and still so that you are not dependent on matter. And that's altogether the wrong approach, because, it is a game you can play. It is one of these possible things. You can play the Jehovah's Witness game. You can play the three-seed in the Spirit Baptist game. All these are various things which you can play, just as you can take up a hobby for bridge or fishing or something like that. But what happens is, you see, that the notion that the material world is an illusion is turned into a judgment of value. If it's an illusion, therefore it's bad. I ought not to be under this illusion. Well, the reality of the matter is that if you see that the material world is an illusion, you can enjoy it a great deal better than if you think it isn't. A true materialist, therefore, is one who knows that material is an illusion. Then he's not afraid of it. Then he can enter into the dance of material with real zest. Because you see, if you're a false and a fake materialist, what's happened? You borrowed money to buy yourself a Cadillac, an impressive house, ranch style with a picture window and a patio and a swimming pool, and you've bought a lot of stock, and you somehow wangled the money and borrowed it, and you keep lying awake nights wondering if you're going to make the payments. Well, there's no point in that at all. How can you possibly enjoy all this jazz, if that's the kind of jazz you want to enjoy, if you've got to worry about whether you pay for it or not? And you get hopelessly involved, you get commitments here, commitments there, and finally you have a nervous breakdown and shoot yourself. The only way to enjoy material is to disbelieve in it, just as one can disbelieve in money. Then you can have zest for it, you see? Otherwise, it's much better to be poor. I mean, if you have no taste for this kind of life and no real interest in it, but feel that somehow you ought to have it for status reasons, it's much better to stay poor. Not have any of that stuff at all. So, then this is the important thing I'm trying to say. Material is an illusion, but a great illusion. And the point is to swing it, and not to run away from it on the one hand, or to get stuck on it in the other. Then you can play with it. It's just like a wheel going round. If the wheel is too loose on the axle, it wobbles all over the place. If it's too tight, it won't revolve. But you kind of sit loose, you see, to this thing. Not too loose, though. Now, in what way, then, is the material world an illusion? Well, we know a lot about this now from our physics. And we know that what we call solidity is force, contained force. The agitation of particles or wavicles or whatever they are at such an immense speed that they become impenetrable to other agitations. So that when I put my foot on the floor, the reason it doesn't go through the floor is that the floor is coming into existence and going out of existence so rapidly that there is no interval through which my foot can penetrate. Like an airplane propeller, you can't put your head through it without getting it chopped off. Only that if it were going far faster still, it wouldn't even cut your head off. It would just be like banging your head against a brick wall. And it has to be going fast too within an extraordinarily small and restricted space. The airplane propeller is whizzing around through a considerable space in relation to the size of a head. But if it were going much faster, but through much smaller spaces, you see, then it would be like banging your head against a brick wall. So what we've got in our so-called physical objective world is a behavior of energy where matter arises from it through its behavior in restricted spaces. Density is a quality of space rather than a quality of matter, if you see what I mean. I gave the illustration of the airplane propeller to try and show that. So that all this is an electronic, diaphanous world, very similar to other creations of electronic patterns, the dance of forms on the TV screen, the rainbow, the aurora borealis. It's all fundamentally like that. Only we are of the same kind of jazz, you see. Our bodies are this dance too, and therefore the physical world feels real to us. In other words, it feels solid because we are something of the same kind. If we were on a different wavelength, we'd walk right through it, in the same way as radio waves come right through the house. They are of such a nature that they can penetrate the spaces, the interstices, or in some way jazz signals through. And but we are on the same wavelength, you see, as the wall, and so don't go through it. But nevertheless, the whole cosmos is therefore a function of energy, or you could say of light, something like light, and therefore we and it are all diaphanous. Now, it's easier to see that if you live in a medium where things aren't so dense. There's only one other creature as intelligent as man, and this lives in a medium that is less dense, and this is the dolphin. The dolphin is a mammal, and many millions of years ago it seems that dolphins were living on the land. But they are very clever, and they decided that the land was no place to live, because getting food was difficult, and you had to lug yourself around, and there were many, many bad shows about the land. It had very curious changes of temperature. It became unspeakably cold and unspeakably hot, and you had, in fact, to work. Well, no sensible person ever works. I never work, I get paid for playing. And everybody should do that. That's the mark of an educated man, is that eventually he gets a job where he's paid for playing. And a worker, or a proletarian, isn't necessarily a poor man. There are lots of poor, a poor man like, say, Selig Morgenrath or Eric Barker around here, they're not proletarians. A proletarian is a person who is fettered to the process of work. That is to say, to doing chores every day that he really doesn't like and that aren't in the least interesting in order to go on living. So the dolphins decided this is ridiculous, this land existence, and they went back to the water. And it's pretty easy to fish, you see. There are plenty of fish in the water and things to eat. As we know, the ocean is the greatest food supply in the world. And when they'd eaten a few fish or whatever they need, they decided just to have a ball. So the dolphin can get abreast of a ship, get one of the wakes coming out on the side, can set its tail at an angle of 26 degrees, and be pushed along by the ship. And it's not going anywhere. There's no reason to go along there. As if it had to get to another part of the sea is pretty much the same all through. But they're just going boom, and they chatter and dance, and they're really highly civilized beings. And so, please don't anybody ever kill dolphins or be unkind to dolphins, because they're exemplary, high-minded creatures. And we shall soon discover this. As soon as we can set up communication with them, they will tell us all about it, and we will then invent a new style of civilization based on frolic. But you see, they dance in the mode of water. Now, human beings, as Toynbee has pointed out, as their civilization progresses, they begin to lose their roots. And they are less and less tied to the land. They go into the air. And what's going to happen if man develops without blowing himself to bits, if he can get over the hurdle, you see, that dangerous point, is that gradually all roads are going to disappear. And the earth will have centers of human habitation, you see, but no roads. They'll be as obsolete as railroad tracks, because everybody will fly. And once the medium of air is much more fluid than the medium of water. And as we fly, you see, on the land, your values are all values of permanence, solidity, firmness. They're architectonic in the sense of our great stone structures, pyramids and things like that. But in the air and on the water, all values are fluid. And what you have to know to be a good airman is, of course, stars. Like whitethroats and other migrating birds migrate by the stars. Imagine. But once you start relating yourself to the stars, you realize that you're living in a universe where directions are all relative. And you become a being capable of existing in non-solidity. And that's why Buckminster Fuller, believed that all techniques and really all culture came from the sea. The men who first learned to sail were the wise men. He has a fantastic idea that there were initiates, great priests who were ship's captains, and that though some of their humble seamen didn't know all the secrets, that these priests were the first people who knew that the world was round. And that gives one an entirely different theology, you see, than if you believe that the world is flat. And so from the priests of the ocean, the landsmen learned how to use cranes, blocks and tackles, how to build, what a good house an overturned ship made. And so to this day, a cathedral has a nave as its central auditorium, nave from Latin navis, ship, showing the connections between ships and the first temples. And so Fuller goes on to say, now if you're a good architect, as the ancient architects learned from the ocean, first thing you should do when you get through architectural school is go and work in an airplane factory and understand the beautiful thing that man has made in a fine, fine airplane, you see, which is as great as a bird in its own way, because that's the architecture of insecurity. And that really lives with insecurity. Lao Tzu puts it in this way: the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when merits are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. The more, therefore, you relinquish power, trust others, the more powerful you become, but in such a way that instead of having to lie awake nights controlling everything, you do it beautifully by trusting the job to everyone else. And they carry it on for you. So you can go to sleep at night and trust your nervous system to wake you up in the morning. You can even tell it, I want to wake up at 6 o'clock, and it'll wake you up just like an alarm clock. This seems a sort of paradox to say this, but the principle of unity, of coming to a sense of oneness with the whole of the rest of the universe, is not to try to obtain power over the rest of the universe. That will only disturb it and antagonize it and make it seem less one with you than ever. The way to become one with the universe is to trust it as another, as you would another, and say, let's see what you're going to do. But in doing that, you see, in saying that to everything else that you have been taught to think is not you, you are also saying it to yourself. Because finally, as I pointed out, you do not know where your decisions come from. They pop up like hiccups. And when you make a decision, people have a great deal of anxiety about making decisions. There's this guy farmer, who ordered a help man come in, and
found he was an extraordinarily efficient worker, because the first day he put him on sawing logs. And he sawed more logs than anybody had ever sawed. It was fantastic. But it was all done in one day. So the next day he put him on to mending fences. And there were all kinds of broken fences around the farm, and in one day he had the whole thing done. So he thought, what am I going to do with this guy? So he took him down into a basement and said, look, here are all the potatoes that have come in from this harvest. And I want you to sort them into 3 groups. Those that we sell, those that we use for seeding, and those that we throw away. So he left him at that. At the end of the day, the laborer came back and said, well, that's enough, mister. I quit. Oh, he said, you can't quit. I've never had such an excellent worker. I'll raise your salary. I'll do anything to keep you around here. I said, no. It's all right mending fences and chopping wood, but this potato business is decision after decision after decision after decision. So when we decide, we're always worrying, did I think this over long enough? Did I take enough data into consideration? And if you think it through, you find you never could take enough data into consideration. The data for a decision in any given situation is infinite. So what you do is, you go through the motions of thinking out what you will do about this. And then when the time comes to act, you make a snap judgment. I mean, I'm speaking a little extremely, making some fun of it and so on, because after all, we do occasionally get the vague outlines of things and make a right decision on rational grounds. But we fortunately forget the variables that could have interfered with this coming out right. It's amazing how often it works. But warriors are people who think of all the variables beyond their control and what might happen. So then when you make a decision, and it works out all right, I think very little of it has much to do with your conscious intent and control. But somehow or other, you are able to decide and control things more harmoniously if you delegate authority. That's why very great businessmen are those who can delegate authority. Trust others to work for them. Because those are people developing businesses on the same basic structure that is fundamental to a living organism. Delegation of authority. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And you see, then, what is happening is this. The more you let go of it and trust it, as if it were quite other than you, the more you realize the inseparable identity of self and other. To go back, if you try to find the identity of self and other by subjecting other to self, no go. If, on the other hand, you find it through giving self, that is control, over to other, and trusting that, you may make a mistake. You may make a bad gamble. But in the long run, you're acting on a principle which has the backing of evolution. This is the way biological evolution goes on. Constant delegation of authority. That's why, obviously, the democracy is superior to the monarchy. It was de Tocqueville who said that democracy is always right, but for the wrong reasons. Because there is operating in a democracy the principle that Buckminster Fuller calls synergy. And synergy is the intelligence of a highly complex system, the nature of which is always unknown to the individual members. Because that goes back again to this point, that we're always entering a new environment. We don't ever know fully what the new environment is, because the only environments we know are the past ones. There is always then operating in the development of cellular life on any level a new way of organization, higher than any existing form, and we are not aware of it until after it's happened. If you ever saw, for example, the film Kon-Tiki, this man figured out a few things as to how to make a balsa wood raft to sail from South America to the Pacific Islands. But once he had set this in motion, he discovered that all sorts of unexpected factors cooperated with him. That when the wood got wet, it expanded so that the ties bit into it and held it completely secure. He had never expected that. And he found that as he sailed along, a flying fish would simply alight flat on the deck every morning for breakfast. That all kinds of natural factors, it was just, he had touched a key where he was flowing with the course of nature, and everything cooperated with him. Because he had touched the key. He had made the act of faith. And he was just picking up, in other words, a practice which had been hundreds and hundreds of years ago, had been followed by others who had worked it out by their great ecological awareness. So we do come out of this way of thinking to something which has, I would say, the most enormously creative and revolutionary social consequences. That it has become not virtuous, not self-sacrificing, not anything like that. It has become the hardest practical politics to let go control to others, to give up trying to dominate the scene. Also, in a parallel way, it has become at this time in our history very much hard practical politics. To learn how to enjoy ourselves. You can go to the Protestant people with their Protestant ethic who are against this kind of thing, and now say to them with great glee, it is your solemn duty to learn how to enjoy yourself. Why? Because in an age of leisure, people have really got to know how to enjoy themselves. Because if they don't, they'll smash the whole future of the human race. So a utopia has become not some sort of a dream, but an urgent necessity. We can't do without it. Because if we try to do without it, what's going to happen is that we are going to terminate our race in a mutual massacre of scapegoats. And so the present paranoia in the United States that is going on where everybody is thinking up a new scapegoat and how great it will be to demolish them or get them out of power, all this kind of bickering and right and left politics has become irrelevant. Because we now have the opportunity of trusting our own intelligence, our own technology. To take the risk of doing what we want, which will work to the extent that we realize that what I want, basically, what I really want is what you want. And I don't know what you want. Surprised me. But that's the kinship between I and thou. So when I ask, I go right down to the question, should we start it with, what do I want? The answer is, I don't know. When Bodhidharma was asked, who are you? Which is another form of the same question. He said, I don't know. Planting flowers to which the butterflies come. Bodhidharma says, I know not. I don't know what I want. Well, when you don't know what you want, you've reached the state of desirelessness. When you really don't know. But you see, there's a beginning stage of not knowing, and there's an ending stage of not knowing. In the beginning stage, you don't know what you want because you haven't thought about it, or you've only thought superficially. And then when somebody forces you to think about it and go through and say, yeah, I think I'd like this, I think I'd like that, I think I'd like the other, that's the middle stage. Then you get beyond that. Say, is that what I really want? In the end you say, no, I don't think that's it. I might be satisfied with it for a while, and I wouldn't turn my nose up at it. But it's not really what I want. Why don't you really know what you want? 2 reasons that you don't really know what you want. Number 1, you have it. Number 2, you don't know yourself, because you never can. The Godhead is never an object of its own knowledge. Just as a knife doesn't cut itself, fire doesn't burn itself, light doesn't illumine itself. It's always an endless mystery to itself. I don't know. And this I don't know, uttered in the infinite interior of the spirit, this I don't know is the same thing as I love, I let go, I don't try to force or control. It's the same thing as humility. And so the Upanishads say, if you think that you understand Brahman, you do not understand. And you have yet to be instructed further. If you know that you do not understand, then you truly understand. For the Brahman is unknown to those who know it, and known to those who know it not. And the principle is that any time you, as it were, voluntarily let up control, in other words, cease to cling to yourself, you have an access of power. Because you're wasting energy all the time in self-defense. Trying to manage things, trying to force things to conform to your will. The moment you stop doing that, that wasted energy is available. And therefore you are, in that sense, having that energy available, you are one with the divine principle. You have the energy. When you're trying, however, to act as if you were God, that is to say, you don't trust anybody and you're the dictator and you have to keep everybody in line, you lose the divine energy. Because what you're doing is simply defending yourself. So then, the principle is, the more you give it away, the more it comes back. Now you say, I don't have the courage to give it away. I'm afraid. And you can only overcome that by realizing you better give it away because there's no way of holding on to it. The meaning of the fact, you see, that everything is dissolving constantly, that we're all falling apart, we're all in a process of constant death, and that the world we hope men set their hearts upon turns ashes, or it prospers, and like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lighting a little hour or two is gone. You know, all that Omar Khayyam jazz. You know, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the great globe itself, I, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. All falling apart. Everything is. That's the great assistance to you. See, that fact that everything is in decay is your helper. That is allowing you that you don't have to let go because there's nothing to hold on to. It's achieved for you, in other words, by the process of nature. So once you see that you just don't have a prayer, and it's all washed up, and that you will vanish and leave not a rack behind, and you really get with that, suddenly you find you have the power. This enormous access of energy. But it's not power that came to you because you grabbed it. It came in entirely the opposite way. And power that comes to you in that opposite way is power with which you can be trusted. Of course, what we've been talking about is not so much a set of ideas as an experience, or shall we say experiencing. And this kind of seminar, in comparison with encounter groups or workshops of various kinds, or experiments in sensory awareness, is now being called a conceptual seminar. Although I'm not talking about concepts. But the crucial question arises that an understanding, a real feeling understanding, of the polar relationship between the individual and the world is something that operates, as we say, in your bones, and isn't just a view that you hold or a belief that you hold. It's so curious that the emphasis of the Western tradition in religion is primarily upon right belief. Do you believe in the right dogmas and the right doctrines? And only secondarily upon right action. Because what you believe is, in Christianity at any rate, far more important than what you do. Because one is saved through faith, not by works. And early in its history, the Christian church rejected the movement in the church which had been known as Gnosticism, from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge. And in a way, there were some sound reasons for doing so. Because the Gnostics were what I would call anti-materialists. They divided human beings into three classes that were called, respectively, pneumatic, psychic, and hylic. The last one being H-Y-L-I-C, from the Greek hyli, or they would call it now ile, meaning wood. So the people were spiritual, psychological, and wooden. And that is to say, the wooden people were those most absorbed in materiality and most closely identified with their bodies. And Orthodox Christianity rejected this sort of distinction because of the perfectly correct idea that material existence is not inconsistent with spirituality. This is something which most Christians have forgotten. But they do believe as the central principle of Christianity in what's called the incarnation. That in the Jesus of Nazareth, Almighty God did in fact become material, become human. And by this process initiated a transformation of the cosmos. In the words of St. Athanasius, God became man that man might become God. And you don't hear that from the pulpit very often. The Christian Church therefore emphasized pistis, or faith, as against gnosis, or knowledge. Because they said you can never know God. God could never become an object of knowledge. And in this funny roundabout way, the Christian theologians were saying exactly the same thing as the Hindus. Only the Hindus do call this knowledge of God through faith, they call it jnana, which is the same as the Greek word gnosis. But just to give you a little sidelight on how words get mixed up in their meanings, we now have a class of person called an agnostic. And an agnostic generally means a person who doesn't commit himself to any beliefs about the ultimate nature of things. He just says he doesn't know. But the original word, agnosia in Greek, meant a special kind of knowledge. It was called the dark knowledge of God. The knowledge of God in the cloud of unknowing, to use the title of a mystical treatise written by an anonymous 14th century English monk. This monk derived his ideas from a very mysterious figure who wrote under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius was a 5th or 6th century Syrian monk who had learned his mysticism from Porphyry, who got it from Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, and who probably got a great deal of stimulation from the intellectual world of Alexandria. And Alexandria, in the early years of the Christian era, was a tremendous exchange place between East and West. Buddhist monks visited Alexandria. It was one of the great centers of trade between Rome and India. And as you may know, all Rome's gold eventually went to India for the purchase of pepper. And as a result of this, the Roman economy collapsed. They bought too much luxury from India. India, in exchange, got Roman architecture. And you'll see a lot of Roman architecture in Indian temples. But Alexandria was the great center for the Gnostics and for Christian theology. And some of the greatest theologians, Clement, Origen, Athanasius, St. Cyril, all worked out of Alexandria. Well, now going back to this strange monk, Dionysius, it was he who first put around the idea in Christian circles that there was such a thing of the knowledge as the knowledge of God by faith. By agnosia, really, by unknowing. And he, in a book which he wrote, very short book called The Theologia Mystica, he wrote a treatise on the higher knowledge of God, which might be quoted directly from the Upanishads in certain parts of it. The last section of it reads like the Mandukya Upanishad, because it's a series of negations. It says what God is not. And he goes very far, because he says that God is not one. He says our idea of unity falls far short of what God is. So does our idea of Trinity. So does our idea of spirit, our idea of mind, of justice, of love. All these things are not really God. And he says in another place, if anybody, having seen God, understood what he had seen, what he would have seen would not have been God, but some creature of God, less than God, some sort of angel or something like that. It's perfectly amazing to consider the influence that this man had. For writing under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite, he became identified, you see, with St. Paul's first convert in Athens. And legend has it that he was the first bishop of Athens and was martyred in Gaul, where he's known as St. Denis. But St. Thomas Aquinas looked upon the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite as having the highest authority. And you could, if all the texts of Dionysius' work had been lost, you could restore most of it from quotations in St. Thomas. He wrote really two very important books. One was the one I said, the Theologia Mystica. The other was called The Divine Names. And these two books presented the two phases of his theology. The book called The Divine Names was a discussion on the nature of God in terms of what God is like, by analogy. And this kind of knowledge of God he called kataphatic, from the Greek theme, to speak or say, kata, meaning to say according to, that is to say, to speak by analogy. Where he used, though, entirely negative language about God, this sort of discourse was called apophatic. And the word apo meaning away from, to talk away from. Just as a sculptor, when he makes an image, reveals the image by removing stone. And so Dionysius explained that one attains the knowledge of God by discarding concepts, which is exactly what the Hindus mean when they say, of God one can only say neti, neti, not this, not this, not any conception. So thus in Hindu philosophy, the highest state of consciousness in samadhi is called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means literally non-conceptual. Vikalpa means a concept. Nir is a negation. So the non-conceptual knowledge. Now, people have greatly misunderstood this. They have imagined that unknowing the state of the highest contemplation was the acquisition of a blank mind, from which you first discarded thought, you went on to discard perception, you went on to discard any kind of sensory content in awareness, until you were, so far as anyone could say, aware of nothing. And they supposed that this kind of catatonic state was mystical consciousness. This is often believed in India. If you go to the Vedanta Society and ask, what do you mean by nirvikalpa samadhi, they will tell you that the one in that state has no consciousness whatsoever of the sensory world. That he is completely absorbed, as you sometimes see Hindu holy men sitting in a state where they are blind and deaf to everything going on around them. The founder of Chinese Zen, known as Huineng, described people like that as no better than pieces of rock and lumps of wood. He said it's a very serious mistake indeed to confuse sunyata, the Sanskrit word for the great void, which is both the ultimate reality and the consciousness thereof. He said it's a great mistake to confuse it with nothingness. It is rather to be thought of as space, or like space, because space is not empty. It contains the whole universe. And so in the same way, the state of mind of a person who is truly enlightened is not empty. It contains everything. But, like space, it is not stained by what it contains. And it's often said in Zen imagery, you can't hammer a nail into space. You can't spit on the sky and soil it. If you try, the spit will just return and hit your own face. So they go on to say the consciousness in all of us, your basic mind is like space. It is completely pure. But of course by purity, they don't mean unsexual, which is of course what purity generally means in the Western world. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. A person who's pure in heart is generally understood as one who never has any naughty thoughts. You know what naughty means? It means vain, negative, empty. A naughty person, therefore, is one who doesn't amount to anything, who's just nothing. That's the real meaning. But this misunderstanding of the nature of contemplation existed not only in India, from which it was transmitted to China, but also in the West. You read many treatises on Western mysticism, and there's still the feeling that getting into a deep, deep trance, sometimes called rapture, again, the word rapture has undergone some transformations. We talk about rapture as people being beside themselves with pleasure. But to be rapt means to be taken away from the body. So also ecstasy, we now interpret as meaning in a state of high pleasure. But it means to be outside yourself, to stand outside yourself. Your soul has left you, it is with God. As Arabs say of all crazy people, be kind to them. They're not here, their soul is with God. But actually, if it can be true, as Buddhists say, that nirvana and samsara are one, and if it can be true, as Christians say, that the spirit can be made flesh, the word can be made flesh, then obviously the highest form of man is not sitting in a trance like a lump on a log, with a perfectly blank mind. Because if that were the highest state of consciousness, it would be an exclusive state of mind. A state of mind that shuts out life. And in that sense it could not qualify for being what the Hindus call non-dualistic. They always speak of the highest reality as being not one, because one excludes many. Not nothing, because nothing excludes something. Not being, because being excludes non-being, and vice versa. And so they use this word non-dual to mean that which doesn't exclude anything, which, as it were, has no outside. As we say, space has no outside. You can only have outsides inside space. You can't have any outsides outside space. There is no outside space, even though space may be curved and finite. So, if you want to think incidentally of that curved space, go and take a look at a photograph in the life a book on mathematics where there's a picture of a Klein bottle, which is a three-dimensional Möbius strip. A Möbius strip, you know, is a piece of paper that is twisted once and then joined. And it has only one side and only one edge. Now, a Klein bottle is a three-dimensional Möbius strip, and it only has one inside. It has no outside. You can say it has an inside and no outside, or it has an outside and no inside. It's a fabulous little trick. But something like that would be the nature of space, as that which does indeed transcend the opposites. Not quite. No, we'd have to do one extra move on a serpent to make it into a Klein bottle. You'd have to tuck its head through the side of its skin and make the aperture through the mouth continuous with the inside of the serpent towards the tail, you see. That's more or less what a Klein bottle is. So, what I'm getting to, I'm giving you something out of the general history of religions to show that what has been meant by the mystical state, the state of samadhi or awakening in certain traditions, is not this state of trance, but a state of consciousness in which you can perfectly well carry on your daily affairs. And of course, what is meant by a bodhisattva as the ideal type of Buddhist person is that he is not wrapped, that he is actively engaged in the life of the world, because he has gone beyond the illusion that nirvana is to be found away from everyday life. So, what is then the point of meditation? Why meditate? Why do you have to crawl off into a hole, or go to a Zen monastery, or retire and be quiet, when this is only a withdrawal? Is there anything to be said for it? Well, meditation is, in that sense, as a practice, as a discipline, is a very curious problem. Because from one point of view it's a help, and from another point of view a hindrance. And I think we have to understand, first of all, that meditation exercises are medicinal rather than dietary. The same could be said of LSD. A medicine, not a diet. Something that is described in Zen as when you want to open a door, or summon someone to open the door for you, you pick up a brick and you knock on the door, but you don't carry the brick into the house. When you need a raft for crossing a stream, you cross the stream on the raft, but you leave the raft on the bank at the other side. You don't go carrying it around. But a lot of people, when they get into meditation, or they get into religion, or into any kind of exploration of this sort, turn the door into a revolving door and keep on going round and round and round and never get through. They say what a gas it is to be in this revolving door. So I think a good definition of a parasite is the person who goes through a revolving door on someone else's push. So there are all sorts of people in the religious racket who are going through revolving doors. And they're very bitter about people who walk right through and leave the door behind, because they say, well, you haven't paid enough respect. You must really understand religious one-upmanship. It's a tremendously important thing. And don't be caught out by this, because what happens is, there's a little game going on, which I'm going to initiate you into. And it's played in Zen, which is it works like this. If you go to a teacher and ask for spiritual instruction, or even if you come to a seminar like this, you are, by doing that, confusing yourself. Because you are looking for what you're asking for outside, as if someone else could give it to you, as if you didn't have it. So the teacher knows that as long as you do that, You haven't understood. But he doesn't just tell you to go away. Or he may sometimes just say, go away, I'm too busy. And in any case, I can't tell you anything. Well, people won't take that for an answer. They won't take no for an answer. And furthermore, if he just said, go away, they would just find some other teacher who would exploit them and maybe keep them as followers for years and acquire a great deal of money by so doing. But what he does is another thing. He tries to give them the put down, as if to say, you have a great long distance to go yet. Your attainment is not at all perfect. And they're always talking about other sects and other schools and saying, well, they haven't really got the point, you see? So that you keep losing faith in yourself and feeling, my goodness, I haven't yet attained this thing. And that keeps you working. But all the time, you're being talked out. It's like someone who's a pickpocket and he's stolen your own watch and is selling it to you. But just so long as you can be talked out of yourself, you deserve to be. Now, you become very aware of this. If you ever do momentarily slip into some sort of mystical experience, you become aware of this tremendous gamesmanship going on. And you see it as sort of continuous with all sorts of cosmic games that are going on, of creatures eating other creatures up, and the creatures that get eaten, of course, transform themselves into the creatures that eat them, and then in turn eat other creatures. And you see the whole hide-and-seek game going on, and then you realize very clearly that the state of development that you are in now is no better and no worse than anybody else's state. Because it's like space again. Which planet is in, or which star is in the best position? Well, it's all equal. They're all in the middle. Any one can be considered as the center one. Any point on a sphere is the center of the surface of the sphere. So, in the same way, everybody, in all his behavior, whatever he's doing, whether we call him from a certain point of view sick, or whether we call him healthy, whether we call him good or bad, neurotic, normal, psychotic, sane, all the manifestations are just like the leaves on the trees. And in each being in a unique way is, as Christians would say, manifesting the will of God. So, there really, from that point of view, you see, there is nothing to do to attain Buddhahood. Nothing at all. But you see, that's very difficult to understand, because a lot of people, when they hear that there's nothing to do, try to do nothing. And you can't. Because you are karma, and karma means action. You can't do nothing. But the thing you're looking for, or think you're looking for, is what you're doing. Is what's called you. Only, of course, as we all know, we've got ourselves into the idea that oneself is so difficult to see. Because it's like, as I've often said, trying to bite your own teeth or look into your own eyes, and you can't find it. It's always behind. It's like your head is, from the optical point of view, a blank space. Neither light nor dark. It's right in the middle of everything. And so, one of the great tricks of gurus is to set people looking for their heads. There's a famous story of a king in India in ancient times called Yajnadatta. And one morning he woke up and reached out for his mirror and brought it over. No head. He was looking in the wrong side of the mirror. And he was kind of bleary-eyed and had a hangover. So he summoned servants and said, "Ye gods, I've lost my head. Find it." And they said, "But Your Majesty, it's there on your shoulders." He said, "It is not. I can't see it in the mirror. Nobody can show me my head." So they were rushing all over the place, looking for the head. Now the trick to that is, of course, that you are perfectly well aware of your head, only not in a form in which you expect to be aware of it. You expect to be aware of your own head in the same way as you're aware of other people's heads. But that wouldn't be true of you, because you've got an inside view on your head. You have an outside view on other people's heads, because, of course, you're taking an inside point of view. But the way in which you are aware of your head is in terms of what you are seeing and hearing. Because all sights and all sounds are what the nerves inside your head are doing. That's how to be aware of one's head. You are aware, therefore, of yourself, the mysterious self that you have, in terms of experience. Because there isn't really any difference. But that always escapes people, you see. So perpetually, so long as you don't understand that, you can be talked into going on to all kinds of weird excursions. And just so long as you believe it, you're a sucker. You're hooked. And it takes a tremendous inner confidence and nerve finally to say, "Hey, don't pull that stunt on me anymore. I see through your game." And because gurus are very clever at putting you down. But they're just trying to see how strong you are. Testing you out. See if they can hoodwink you. So long as they can, you see, they're going to go on doing it, because they're going to get you to the point where they can't do it to you anymore. Then they'll graduate. And so, one of Rinzai's students, after he saw through it, said, "Well, there wasn't much in Rinzai's Buddhism after all." Of course there wasn't. He said boldly and straight out, "My teaching is just like using an empty fist to deceive a child." You know, when you play games with a child and pretend you've got something here, and the child goes into all kinds of tizzy to get you to open your hand and show what it is, and then there's nothing. Fooled. So you can be fooled. As long as you can be fooled. When you can't be fooled, you don't ask the question anymore. Because it's all become clear. It's all become clear that there is no puzzle about this universe. What makes you think there are puzzles about this universe? Very simple reason. You're trying to explain it. And when you explain things, what do you mean by explanation? There are several meanings of explanation. There's really one basic meaning. But first of all, to be able to translate what is happening into terms of words or numbers. In other words, to describe. But a real explanation is not just a description. It's a description which enables us to control what we are describing. But didn't we see in the last session that to control the world is not really what we want to do? So that if all explanations have as their function enabling us to control things, then maybe an explanation isn't what we wanted. And furthermore, you can very simply see that what makes things complicated is explaining them. When somebody explains to you how a flower works, and he's a great botanist, and analyzes all the innards of a flower, and shows the channels, the fibers, the processes of reproduction, and so on that go on in it, everybody stands fascinated. Say, how complicated that is. How clever God must have been to create that flower, to have all that complexity going. It isn't complicated at all. It's only complicated when you start thinking about it. Because the vehicle of words is a very clumsy one. And when you try to talk about the processes of nature, what is complicated is not the processes of nature, but trying to put them into words. That's as complicated as trying to drink up the ocean with a fork. It takes forever. And so this intense complexity that we see in everything is created by our attempt to analyze it all. And so what we do is, you see, when we analyze, we use our eyes and ears as scalpels. And we dissect everything. And we have to put a label on every piece we chop off. And so we scalpelize, and we get it right down to atoms, getting finer and finer, and we suddenly thought, well, we've got to the end of it, because the word atom means what is not cuttable. Atomos. But then we found we could cut the atom. And lo and behold, big fleas had little fleas upon their backs to bite them. And it goes on forever. There is no end to the minuteness which you can unveil through physical investigation. For the simple reason that the investigation itself is what is chopping things into pieces. And the sharper you can sharpen your knife, the finer you can cut it. And the knife of the intellect is very sharp indeed. And the sophisticated instruments that we can now make, well, there's probably no limit to it. But in a way, all that is vain knowledge. In a way. Because you see, what it does is, it gives you the illusion that you've solved your problems. When you have controlled certain things, and you have solved certain problems, practical problems, you say, fine, more of that, please. Let's go on solving problems. And then you do. And you create a world of people, as we are today, far more comfortable than people who lived in the 19th century. Just remember the troubles of going to a dentist when you were children, or some of you when you were children, of medicine, of badly heated homes, of all sorts of things that we don't put up with anymore. But the problem is we keep running into this thing that all constant stimulations of consciousness become unconscious. And when we take it as a matter of course to have certain comforts, then we switch the level on which we worry. When you solve a whole set of problems, people find new ones to worry about. And after a while, you begin to get that haven't we been here before feeling. Aren't we just going round on a cycle and doing the same old thing over and over and over again because we don't realize that we're chasing our own tails? By an eternally recurrent process of not knowing who you are. That is the hide and seek. That is the nature of what the Hindus call the Manvantara and the Pralaya the period of the Manvantara in which the worlds are manifested, and the period of the Pralaya in which the worlds are withdrawn from manifestation. In and out, in and out. Evermore came out by the same door as in I went. And the thing is to get to the point where you can see that you are doing that in every moment of your existence, with every tiny little atom of your body. You now, at this minute, you see, are the whole system of inning and outing. In other words, you often think perhaps, maybe a long, long time ahead, I shall reach the point where I wake up from manifestation and overcome the world illusion and discover that I am the supreme reality behind all this diversification. My friends, there is no diversification. In other words, what you call diversification is your game. In the same way as you chop the thing and then you say it is made of pieces. Because you forget that you cut it. And so when you see the world as complicated and that there are life problems and that you might one day succeed. See, hundreds and hundreds of people are running like mad after something that they call that is success, and they have no idea what it is. So in exactly the same way, the guru is keeping you running and running after spiritual attainment. You don't know what you want. This is where Krishnamurti is so clever. Because he says, if you ask me for enlightenment, how can you ask me for enlightenment? If you don't know what it is, how do you know you want it? Is that any concept you have of it will be simply a way of trying to perpetuate the situation you're already in. If you think you know what you're going out for, all you're doing is you're seeking the past, what you already know, what you've already experienced. Therefore, that's not it, is it? Because you say you're looking for something quite new. But what do you mean new? What's your conception of something new? Well, you figure I can only think about it in terms of something old. Something I once had. So he doesn't say anything. He doesn't indicate anything positively. Everybody says, why are you so negative? Why don't you give us something to hang on to? Well, the simple answer is it would be spurious. You don't need anything to hang on to. You're it. You don't need a religion. But then you say, well, what is all this religious stuff about then? Why don't we just forget it? You can try. By all means. Just go away. Don't go to gurus. Don't go to church. Don't enter philosophical discussions. Forget it. But then you'll realize that by having consented to forget it, you're still seeking. What a trap. What can you do? You see? If you stay here and listen to me or to anyone else who comes around here, you're fooling yourself. But if you go away, you're fooling yourself too. Because you still think that's going to improve your situation. It won't. And therefore, when you discover that it doesn't, you'll think, well, maybe it was a mistake to go away, and you come back to the guru. And he looks at you and says, you are very undisciplined, very inferior student. And you need to apply yourself. Well, as I explained what he's doing. But it comes down in a way to a sort of contest with the guru. You see? Will you call his bluff? You're afraid to. Because you might discover that if you do call his bluff, he's no better than you are. Well, that's what you're supposed to find out. But without being cynical about it. He's as divine as you are. But you've got to call the bluff. There's going to be a showdown. And it's a double bind. The whole situation's a double bind. Because it doesn't do any good to stay here, and it doesn't do you any good to go away. Either to do something about it or to do nothing about it. Now then, there's something else. When you understand that, and when you realize that there's nothing to realize, because it's all here, then what are you going to do? Well, of course, this is the sense of the Zen poem: supernatural activity and marvelous power, drawing water, carrying fuel. You know, do whatever one does as a human being. But there's a little element of Philistinism in that. It's like when a child is pestering father or mother with all sorts of questions. They finally get down to the deepest metaphysical problems. They say, "Oh, shut up and eat your donut." And I wouldn't say that, you see, at this point. Because life, as one looks at it, you see, is in fact a celebration of itself. When you look out at night at the stars and you really wonder, good God, what is all that about? Well, it's a firework display. And it's celebrating High Holy Day. It's whoopee. And the whole world is whoopee. It's a kind of exuberance. And therefore the proper function of religion is digging this. It's not seeking. It's not seeking anything, but is, in a way, thanksgiving. That's why, of course, the Christians were right in calling the Mass the Eucharist, the thanksgiving. Only they had such a complicated way of thinking about it that nobody could understand it. So in religion, all religious exercises, whether they are meditative or whether they are ritualistic, are whoopee. They are not something you do in order to attain anything. They are like art forms, like dancing. They are expressive of attainment, of the attainless attainment. So here's another hang-up for you. When you go to Mr. Suzuki, who runs the Zen Center, he's a good disciple of Dogen, who brought Zen, a certain school of Zen to Japan in the 13th century. Dogen said, you can't sit and meditate unless you're already a Buddha. In which case, why meditate? Well, meditation is just the way a Buddha sits. And he called this sitting just to sit, not to attain enlightenment. Because the minute you do that, you see, you're not meditating. So you only become a good meditator if you're not looking for anything. And therefore, you realize what a great thing it is to be able to sit. And what a great thing it is not to dissect the world with your analytical intellect. To be able to look out at the water or the trees or at the floor and the light on it in front of you without calling it light or floor or trees or thinking that it has parts or thinking that it's complicated. It isn't. So when you can sit without thinking, not with an empty mind, mind you, I'm going back to that point, not with an empty mind, but just a non-analytic mind, a non-probing mind, where you're not creating problems all the time by trying to control it, by trying to control your mind, by trying to control your experience, what you see and hear. You then just simply discover that there is no way of controlling what you're experiencing, because what you're experiencing is you. And to try and really fundamentally control that is just going around in a circle. So if I would say to you now, what you have to learn is to let it happen, that's wrong too. There's no one to let it happen. If I say to you, accept your experience, be calm and open to things, that again perpetuates the illusion that you're something different from it. And so we go round and round. But if there are some people who want to get together, and like we would get together to play poker, or to have a walk, go fishing, or sail a boat, if there are some people who want to get together to meditate, and to have rituals, and to chant, great. It's an art form. And you can only use it and make it a good art form if you're not using it to get something. And this is what really is the bane of temples all over the world. You go into Buddhist temples where they theoretically don't believe in any God. But there are the people praying. And they're all doing it in order that we get a male child next time around, or that the horse recover from a disease, or that mama gets cured of the dropsy. And all these petitions are going on and on and on. People are always coming to the temple to ask for something. Lowbrow people for lowbrow things, highbrow people for highbrow things. And there all the vendors sit outside and sell souvenirs and magic and charms, and all the people go in and do this. And all these serious priests sitting there, really having to keep up face and say, yes, we can provide these services. On the other hand, if you go in to one of these temples, along with all the faithful followers, and have a ball, buy a bead, buy a candle, buy a this, buy that, buy some incense, go in, and dig this great thing going on, salute the Buddhas, or the altars, or the crucifixes, or what you will. But don't take it seriously. And this is one of the great important transformations of today in our consciousness, is that a great many people are finding out that religion is not supposed to be taken seriously. This is a shocking thing to many people. There used to be an old saying that a religion is dead when the priests laugh across the altars. That's true in one sense. When the priests know that they've got a racket going, and they don't believe one word of it, and they're laughing across the altar because of all these suckers around doing it, then it's true. The religion is dead. But when the priests laugh at the altars, because they're having such fun, because this whole scene is so beautiful, well, it's the difference between some stuffy old Buddhist priest humming a sutra and Allen Ginsberg chanting a sutra. That's a thing to hear. Because there's people going, they go on for interminably. It's a bore. They're sick of it. But they get paid for it. This is magical. But when Allen Ginsberg chants the sutra, everybody gets in a circle and he gets these little bells, and they get going. It's just like a jam session, where everybody is absolutely delighted. Well, that's the way to do it. And if you can't do it that way, forget it.